Gospel music has always been about truth, power, and the soul's deepest cry. It built churches, carried movements, and gave us voices that could shake the heavens. But behind the soaring notes and the hallelujahs, there were stories kept in silence. Stories of legends who sang their hearts out for God, but had to hide who they truly were from the world. In this video, we uncover 15 gospel greats whose voices shaped history, yet whose sexuality remained a guarded secret until long after the spotlight faded. Get ready, because this is a side of gospel history they never told you. 1.
With you, I really want to see you, Lord, but it's
Billy Preston's story is one of those profound American tales that feels almost too expansive to be contained by any single label. To the world, he was a whirlwind of musical genius, the charismatic keyboardist whose name is forever etched in history as the fifth Beatle, a title earned not through hype, but through sheer, undeniable talent. His hands danced across the keys with a funky, gospel-soaked fervor that could elevate a simple melody into a spiritual experience. He brought a soulful authenticity to everything he touched, from the raw energy of Ray Charles's band to the polished psychedelia of the Beatles' final years. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of international fame and the roar of concert crowds, there existed another, far more private Billy Preston, a man navigating complexities of his identity in the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of the music industry. Long before he was sharing stages with rock icons, Billy Preston was a child prodigy rooted firmly in the powerful soil of the black church. His musical language was forged in the fire of devotion, a vocabulary of shouts, moans, and ecstatic piano runs meant to uplift the spirit. He toured as a teenager with the queen of gospel herself, Mahalia Jackson, an experience that imprinted upon him not just a musical style, but a certain expectation of living. The gospel world, while full of immense love and community, often existed within a framework of traditional values, a reality that would subtly shape the contours of his life forever. As his career exploded into the pop stratosphere, Billy became a figure of immense joy and magnetic energy. He was impossible to miss on stage, with his broad, infectious smile and the towering afro that seemed to crackle with the same electricity as his famous Fender Rhodes. He had #1 hits like Nothing from Nothing and Will It Go Round in Circles, won Grammy Awards, and collaborated with the greatest names in music history. His public persona was one of effortless cool and boundless enthusiasm, but the private man lived in a different key. For Billy Preston, being a gay man in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and particularly a black gay man in the industries of rock, soul, and gospel, meant living a life of careful compartmentalization. The pressures were immense and came from all sides. The rock world, for all its support of rebellion, was often deeply homophobic. The soul and R&B scenes were steeped in a culture of hypermasculinity, and the gospel community that formed his core musical identity was largely unwelcoming. To openly acknowledge his truth risked not just his career, but the very relationships that defined his world. 2.
this train.
Sister Rosetta Tharpe's voice was a force of nature, a powerful, clear-toned instrument that could shout down injustice or whisper a prayer of profound tenderness. Her fingers, adorned with rings, flew across the fretboard of her electric guitar with ferocity and skill that left audiences, both sacred and secular, in a state of awe. Long before the world coined the term rock and roll, she was its architect, a black woman in a flowing choir robe shredding on a Gibson SG with a sanctified swing that would directly shape the sound of Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Chuck Berry. Her stage presence was undeniable, a bold proclamation of talent and spirit. Yet, the full picture of Rosetta Tharpe, the woman behind the monumental sound, reveals a pioneer not just in music, but in living her truth with a quiet courage that defied the conventions of her era. In a time when such things were almost never spoken publicly, Rosetta Tharpe lived as an openly bisexual woman within her community. Her personal life was a testament to a different kind of faith, one of authenticity. The most significant and enduring relationship was with her fellow gospel singer and touring partner, Marie Knight. Their partnership was a powerhouse, Knight's robust, contralto voice providing the perfect earthy counterpoint to Tharpe's soaring leads. On stage, they were a dynamic duo, preaching the word through song. Off stage, for those who knew them, They were life partners, their romantic bond an open secret within the tight-knit circles of jazz and gospel musicians in cities like New York. Their relationship, however, could not escape the immense pressures of the outside world. The relentless touring, the scrutiny, and the pervasive societal prejudices of the 1940s and 50s took their toll. The couple eventually parted ways professionally and romantically, a heartbreak played out in the quiet margins of their very public lives. Tharpe would marry men on several occasions, moves that were likely a combination of genuine connection and a necessary social shield, a common practice for LGBTQ+ individuals seeking a measure of protection or normalcy in a hostile world. 3. The title King of Gospel Music was not bestowed lightly. It was earned through a lifetime of devotion, innovation, and a soul-deep understanding of the power of song to both mourn and uplift. The Reverend James Cleveland wasn't just a performer. He was an architect of sound, a composer who gave voice to a generation's longing in faith. With his gravelly preacher's baritone and his virtuosic, pounding piano style, he tore down the wall between the pulpit and the pew, inviting everyone into a collective experience of spirit. He founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, a nurturing ground for countless artists, and his development of the Chicago sound, rich, majestic, and choir-driven, forever changed the landscape of sacred music. His anthems, like Peace Be Still and Lord Help Me Hold Out, became the bedrock of the black church experience. Songs that felt less like performances and more like answered prayers. Yet, for a man whose life's work was about testimony and witness, Reverend Cleveland carried profound and painful silence within him. Where he was most revered, his identity as a gay man existed as a carefully managed open secret, a truth known by many but spoken by few. The very institution he helped to build, the black church, often held deeply conservative and homophobic views, creating an impossible tension. How does a man preach liberation while feeling compelled to hide a fundamental part of his own being? This duality was the cross he bore privately, a silent countermelody to his very public ministry. His death in 1991 from complications related to AIDS sent a seismic shock through the world of gospel and forced a conversation many were unwilling to have. The illness, heavily stigmatized at the time and wrongly labeled a gay plague, became a cruel and public reveal of the life he had kept so meticulously private. In passing, the King of Gospel could no longer control the narrative. The whispers grew into a discussion, one fraught with pain, judgment, and for some, a painful reckoning with the church's own failings. For Alex Bradford didn't just sing gospel music. He built a stage for it, draped it in sequins and drama, and invited the world to see it anew. He was a force of nature wrapped in flamboyant elegance, a composer, singer, and actor whose very being challenged the staid conventions of what a gospel artist could be. With a voice that could shake the rafters of church or captivate the hushed audience of a Broadway theater, Bradford was, in every sense, a pioneer. He was a central architect in the rise of gospel musical theater, a genre that took the raw, spiritual energy of the church and framed it with the narrative power of a play, early performance. It was a revelation, a joyous explosion that proclaimed gospel was not just for Sunday morning, but for every night of the week. Long before his Tony Award would cement his place in theatrical history, Bradford was a prodigy in Alabama, preaching and singing with intensity that marked him as special. His move to Chicago plunged him into the heart of a vibrant gospel scene, where his talents as a writer and arranger quickly shone. He penned over 300 songs, including the classic Too Close to Heaven, and his theatrical flair made his live performances legendary. He would sweep onto the stage with a kinetic energy, his gestures broad, his expressions vivid, his connection with the audience absolute. This wasn't just a man singing a song. It was a man embodying a story, and everyone in the room was invited into it. This innate theatricality found its ultimate expression in his collaboration with director Vinette Carroll. Together, they created the groundbreaking musical, Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, a vibrant retelling of the Gospel of Matthew built upon the music of Bradford and his close friend, the Reverend James Cleveland. The show was a sensation, moving from off-Broadway to a triumphant main stage run that earned Bradford a Tony Award for Best Original Score. He had successfully translated the ecstatic language of the black church for a mainstream audience without diluting a single drop of its power. What was perhaps most revolutionary about Alex Bradford, however, was the way he lived his life. In an era of stifling conformity, Bradford was unapologetically, gloriously himself. To those within his circles in the arts and gospel communities, he was openly gay, his charismatic and theatrical personality a seamless blend of his artistic and personal identities. He refused to compartmentalize himself. The same flamboyance that infused his stage presence was present in his daily life. In his style, his wit, and his bearing, he navigated a world that often demanded secrecy with a startling and courageous authenticity, finding a way to be both a revered figure in gospel and a man living his truth without apparent compromise. This visibility came with its own quiet battles, no doubt. The same gospel community that celebrated his genius could also be a place of judgment, and the tension between his identity and the conservative leanings of the church was a landscape he had to navigate with care and charisma. Yet, he seemed to transcend it through the sheer force of his talent and the genuine love he held for the music. He wasn't trying to be a symbol. He was simply being Alex Bradford, and in doing so, he became one anyway, a beacon for those who saw in him the possibility of living without borders. His death in 1978 from a respiratory illness felt tragically early, silencing a voice that was still rich with possibility. But the stage he built remains. To hear the music of Your Arms Too Short to Box with God is to feel his spirit. The joy, the drama, the unwavering faith, and the bold, brilliant flair of a man who knew that the greatest testimony was to live and create as your whole, true self. His legacy is a reminder that spirit and spectacle are not opposites, but partners in a glorious, foot-stomping celebration of life. 5.
Arms alone.
Thomas A. Dorsey, often celebrated as a father of gospel music, was a man who carried both triumph and turbulence in his soul. He gave the world songs that seemed to bridge heaven and earth, compositions like Take My Hand, Precious Lord, which became a lifeline for grieving hearts and a hymn of strength in moments of despair. He pioneered a sound that was born from the church, but carried the weight of the blues, a blend of sacred and sorrowful that gave gospel its unmistakable power. To hear Dorsey's music was to hear a man's spirit reaching for God, even while wrestling with the shadows of his own humanity. Behind the public reverence, however, was a life far more complex than the pews ever knew. Married to Nettie and admired as a husband, a father, and a churchman, he also lived with hidden desires that brought him great conflict. Accounts whispered among those closest to him, and threads as biographies, suggest that Dorsey was bisexual, navigating relationships with men even as he sought to build a holy legacy. It was not a truth he could carry openly in his time, especially in conservative and sacred circles that lifted his music high. And so it remained inside him unspoken, adding another layer of anguish to a man already marked by loss, tragedy, and the heavy calling of his art. Dorsey's story, then, is not just about a genius who gave gospel music its wings. It is also the story of a man who bore secrets that the world would not let him share, a man who poured his contradictions into melodies that sounded like both confession and prayer. His music still lives on, not only because of its spiritual depth, but because it was born from a soul that knew struggle, longing, and love in many forms. 6. Rance Allen was a voice that seemed to stretch far beyond human limits. A powerhouse singer whose multi-octave range made audiences feel as if heaven itself had cracked open for a moment. With the Rance Allen Group, he carved out a sound that blended gospel, soul, and even a touch of rock, breaking boundaries and reaching listeners far beyond the church walls. His voice could thunder with raw force and then glide into tender falsettos that seemed to cradle the heart. To many, he was not just a gospel singer. He was gospel personified, alive in flesh and sound. For over 40 years, Bishop Allen was devoted to his wife, Jean, a partnership that anchored him as he traveled the world and poured his energy into ministry and music. But beneath that surface of devotion, he carried a truth that weighed heavily on his spirit. In his later years, he spoke with disarming honesty about his struggles with same-sex attraction, daring to name a conflict that so many in the gospel world had only whispered about in private. In doing so, he broke a kind of silence. giving voice to the unspoken war between faith and desire, between the pulpit's expectations and the heart's realities. That confession did not erase his towering legacy, but rather deepened it. It showed a man of immense faith who was also deeply human, who wrestled with himself as passionately as he wrestled with a song. In his openness, he became one of the few gospel legends to acknowledge this hidden struggle out loud, leaving behind not just unforgettable music, but a testament to the courage it takes to live in truth, even when that truth is fraught with pain and contradiction. 7. Walter Hawkins was a man whose music carried the promise of eternity. His songs, like The Timeless Going Up Yonder, spoke of a hope beyond sorrow, a heaven waiting just past the tears of this world. With his smooth voice and luminous compositions, he helped shape a golden era of gospel, leading choirs that sounded like they were already rehearsing for glory. To hear Walter was to feel both comforted and challenged, lifted into the certainty that God was near and that the soul had a place to belong. His marriage to the dazzling Tramaine Hawkins was one celebrated as gospel royalty, two luminous figures whose union seemed to mirror the power and poise of the music they sang. But behind the polished image was a reality that those closest to him quietly understood. Within the industry, it was no secret that Walter was a gay man, even as the wider church world never dared to name it. This truth lived inside him as a kind of private storm, a battle between the faith he preached, the music he poured out like prayer, and the desires he could not change about himself. For Walter, the struggle was never simple. It was a kind of internal war that left scars, unseen but felt in the way he sang with such yearning, such depth of longing. His life became a careful balance of devotion and concealment, joy and sorrow. Yet out of that tension came music that has outlived him, songs that still comfort the brokenhearted and strengthen the weary. Walter Hawkins remained a legend not only because of his awards or his accomplishments, but because he carried both light and shadow within him. And from that complex truth, he created beauty. His legacy is not just in the notes of his songs, but in the reminder that even saints wrestle, and even in their wrestling, they leave behind gifts that heal the world. 8. Tramaine Hawkins has always been a force of nature, a voice that could rattle the walls of the sanctuary and still find its way tenderly into the human heart. From her days with the Edwin Hawkins Singers to her own soaring solo career, she brought gospel into new spaces, singing with the conviction of a preacher and the brilliance of a star. Her electrifying hit Fall Down shook the gospel world with its crossover success, proving that her gift could not be confined to one sound, one audience, or one tradition. To hear Tramaine sing was to feel both the fire of revival and the ache of intimacy, a rare combination that made her unforgettable. Her marriage to Walter Hawkins once shimmered as gospel's golden couple, a union of two anointed voices who seemed destined to carry the kingdom together. But like many stories told in hushed tones behind the curtains of the church, their relationship was layered with complexity. Those who knew them best have long whispered that Tramaine, like Walter, was also navigating her own truth, that she loved women. Unlike Walter, she has never publicly addressed these claims, never sought to confirm or deny, choosing instead to keep her private life sealed while she poured herself into ministry and music. What is undeniable is that her life, like her voice, has been marked by both triumph and tension. In a world and an industry that often demands silence around identity, Tramaine chose to let her songs speak louder than any speculation, and they have. Her music continues to resonate with power and grace, lifting congregations and concert halls alike. Tramaine Hawkins remained a legend not only because of her extraordinary gift, but because of the way she has carried herself through the years, with resilience, dignity, and a fierce commitment to her calling. Whatever truth she has chosen to hold close, her voice tells us everything. That love, struggle, faith, and passion can all live inside one soul and still rise into something transcendent. 9. Yvette Flunder has never been content to simply sing the gospel. She has lived it, embodied it, and stretched it wide enough to hold those who were always told they had no place inside the church. A gifted vocalist who first rose to prominence as part of the Walter Hawkins Singers, her voice carried the same warmth and conviction that defined the Golden Hawkins sound. But where many chose silence, Flunder chose courage. She stepped out not just as an artist, but as a pastor, a bishop, and a leader determined to create a space where God's love truly included everyone. Openly lesbian in a world that often demanded secrecy, she stood as a living contradiction to the rules that sought to bind her. While others hid their truth for survival, Flunder placed hers on the altar, unashamed and unwavering. She founded the City of Refuge United Church of Christ in Oakland, a sanctuary for the marginalized, the outcast, the wounded, and the silenced. Her ministry became a radical act of healing, a declaration that queer bodies and queer love are not outside of God's embrace, but are central to God's kingdom. Her story is deeply tied to the Hawkins legacy, yet her path has been her own. Where Walter's struggle remained private, Yvette turned hers into testimony, using her voice both in song and in preaching to affirm that faith and authenticity need not be enemies. She is one of the few in gospel history who refuse to trade honesty for acceptance, and in doing so, she has become a beacon, not just for LGBTQ plus believers, but for anyone who has ever felt cast aside by religion. Yvette Flunder's legacy is still unfolding, but already speaks with prophetic clarity. She reminds us that gospel music was always born from the cries of those who long for freedom, and she has carried that spirit into her ministry. Her life is a hymn of defiance and belonging, proof that the truest form of worship is living one's truth out loud. 10. Sandra Crouch lived in the shadow of her famous twin brother Andre, but she was never truly overshadowed. She was a force in her own right, a Grammy-winning gospel artist, a skilled percussionist whose rhythms gave life to choirs, and a vocalist whose voice could blend seamlessly or stand on its own with authority. Together with Andre, she helped shape a sound that carried gospel into the modern era, reaching audiences who might never have stepped into a sanctuary, but who felt something holy in the music. Sandra's artistry was steady, reliable, and deeply anointed, the kind of gift that never demanded the spotlight, but made everything around it shine brighter. She lived her life quietly, never marrying, never making public her most personal truths. In a world where the church's gaze was sharp and unyielding, Sandra chose privacy as her shield. After her passing, those who loved her and walked closely with her began to speak what she herself had never openly confessed, that she was a lesbian. It was a truth she carried gently and silently, a truth she kept hidden to protect both herself and the ministry she had devoted her life to. That silence was not emptiness. It was its own kind of sacrifice, a decision made in the tension between faith and freedom, between her authentic self and the world she gave her music to. Yet within that silence, Sandra still left behind a testimony. Her rhythms, her songs, her unwavering support of Andre, and their shared mission all speak of a woman who gave the church immeasurable treasures, even while it demanded she bury a part of herself. Sandra Crouch's legacy, then, is layered. She was a brilliant artist, a devoted servant, and a woman who bore the weight of secrecy with quiet strength. Her life reminds us that behind the harmonies and the hallelujahs often stand stories untold. Stories of love, of longing, of truths carried in silence. And yet, even unspoken, her truth was real, and her contribution to gospel remains unforgettable. 11.
Seen millions of faces, but there were times when
Andre Crouch was a rare kind of artist who changed the very shape of gospel music. Called the father of modern gospel, he carried the sound of the church into places it had never gone before, into pop, into film, into the wider world where millions who had never set foot in a sanctuary suddenly found themselves moved by the Spirit in his songs. With 7 Grammy Awards, countless hits, and collaborations that stretched from Michael Jackson to Madonna, his influence was staggering. Yet no matter how far his music traveled, always bore the mark of the sacred, always sounded like a prayer stitched into melody. He was a bridge, and gospel crossed with him. But even as he stood as one of the most visible ambassadors of gospel, Andre's personal life was shrouded in silence. He never married, and for decades, speculation swirled quietly around him. Those who knew him best, friends and biographers alike, have since spoken of a truth he never publicly claimed, that he was a gay man. It was a reality he carried privately, Never able to reconcile the fullness of who he was with the expectations of the church that adored his music, that tension haunted him, shaping a lifelong struggle between his faith and his identity. Perhaps that struggle is part why his songs carry such aching power. They are filled with the yearning of a soul that both trusted God completely and carried unspoken burdens. His music feels like both triumph and confession, as he poured into melody the words he could never say aloud. And still, he gave the world joy. He gave the church anthems. He gave gospel a new language that made room for honesty, vulnerability, and imagination. Andraé Crouch remains one of gospel's greatest giants, not only because of what he achieved, but because of what he endured. His story is one of brilliance touched with pain, of faith that coexisted with secrecy, of a man whose gift carried millions closer to God while he wrestled in silence. His legacy is the sound of gospel reborn, but it is also the reminder that even the most anointed among us are human, beautifully, painfully human. 12.
And we be coming home, and we pass by her, and she...
Donald Vails was a master at drawing sound out of choir the way a painter draws color from a canvas. He was a celebrated director, pianist, and producer whose touch could transform even the most ordinary ensemble into something radiant and alive. From his early work with the Caravans to collaborations that stretched as far as Stevie Wonder, his career was a testament to both versatility and brilliance. In the gospel music workshop circuit, he became a towering figure, an architect of harmony, a mentor, and a force who shaped the very culture of modern gospel performance. For many singers and musicians, being under Vails' direction was like stepping into a classroom where music became both craft and calling. Yet beyond his genius of the piano and the podium, Donald Vails carried a truth that the gospel world was not ready to embrace. He was a gay man, and he lived during a time when that reality was not only condemned, but often deadly. His life became entangled with a silence that so many in gospel were forced to keep, a silence made heavier by the stigma of the AIDS crisis that swept through the 1980s and early 90s. When he died in 1992 from AIDS-related illness, the loss was felt deeply, but the truth of who he was remained largely unspoken in public tributes. For those who knew him personally, however, there was no denying the fullness of his identity. He was a musician, a teacher, a friend, and a man who loved as he loved. His sexuality did not erase his gift, nor did his illness diminish his legacy. If anything, the way he created beauty in the midst of a world that demanded his silence makes his contributions all the more profound. Donald Vails' story is a reminder of how many voices the church has both lifted up and pushed into the shadows. His music still echoes, not only in recordings, but in the countless directors and singers he influenced along the way. He left behind choirs that could still catch fire under his arrangements, notes that still move through sanctuaries, and a legacy that insists that brilliance can flourish even when the world tries to bind it. His life, both celebrated in silence, belongs in the great chorus of gospel history. 13.
Let my
Bessie Griffin was one of those singers who could make a whole room tremble. Her voice was not just strong, it was commanding, the kind of sound that didn't ask permission, but simply took hold of you. She came up through the gospel tradition in New Orleans, where church and music were inseparable, and by the time she joined the Caravan, she had already learned how to wrap her voice around a song and make it feel like both a prayer and a storm. People remember her not just for the notes she could hit, but for the way she poured herself into every lyric, as if the music was the only place she could fully breathe. Yet behind the music was a life that was more complicated than the church pews and choir stands would allow. In gospel circles, whispers followed her, stories of her closest to women that could never be spoken too loudly. It was a kind of talk that lived in hallways and late-night phone calls, in knowing looks passed between people who both understood and feared what such truths could mean. In the church of her time, where salvation and respectability were tightly woven together, there was no room to stand openly as both a gospel singer and a woman who loved women. So Bessie, like so many others, lived between the lines, giving everything she had to the music, while holding back parts of herself from public view. Her artistry was her safe place, the stage where her voice could testify in ways her life never could. When she sang, there was freedom, a kind of release that might have been as much for her as it was for the people listening. To hear her was to feel as though she was working something out with God in real time, taking all the heaviness, the longing and the unspoken truths, and turning them into sound. That may be why people still remember her with such reverence, not just as another great gospel singer, but as someone whose music carried an intensity that seemed born of struggle as much as faith. Bessie Griffin's story is a reminder of how many gospel legends had to navigate collision between who they were and what the church demanded. She never stood on a stage and declared her truth, but those who knew her, those who loved her, understood. And perhaps if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it in her recordings. A woman who gave her whole heart to gospel music, even when she could not give her whole self to the world. 14. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax was one of those rare singers who could lift a quartet into the heavens with nothing more than his voice. His high, urgent tenor pierced through harmonies with fire and conviction, the kind of sound that could shake a Sunday night crowd into shouting or carry a weary soul into quiet release. He sang with some of the most legendary groups of his era, the Spirit of Memphis, the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi, and later the Five Blind Boys of Alabama, bringing with him a tone so distinctive that once you heard it, you never forgot it. Broadnax was a heartbeat of quartet singing, a man whose gift belonged to the very core of gospel tradition. But Little Axe carried more than music inside him. He lived his entire life as a man, in an age and in a church where conversations about gender identity did not exist, let alone gain acceptance. To his peers, he was always Brother Broadnax, a small but mighty figure who gave everything to the gospel stage. No one questioned it. He was respected, admired, and loved in the male-dominated world of quartet gospel, holding his own and then some. His secret, if you could even call it that, was his truth. He was transgender in a time when that word was almost unimaginable in the black church community. When he died in 1992, the world discovered what he had never spoken aloud, that he had been assigned female at birth. The revelation sent shockwaves through gospel circles, not because it diminished him, but because it forced people to reckon with just how deeply he had lived as himself in a world that would not have allowed it openly. The same strength that came through in his singing had carried him through a lifetime of navigating identity with dignity, courage, and authenticity. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax's story is more than a footnote in gospel history. It is a testimony to the resilience of a person who chose to live as who they knew themselves to be long before language and society made space for that kind of truth. His voice remains on the old records, soaring above harmonies, powerful and unshakable, a reminder that gospel music has always been carried by people whose lives were far more complicated, brave, and beautiful than the church was ever willing to admit. 15. Carl Bean's journey began in the pulsing heart of gospel music, where his voice first carried him into the spotlight. Born in Baltimore, he grew up surrounded by the sound of church choirs and the spirit of Sunday mornings that shaped so many gospel greats. For a time, he walked the familiar path of the gospel singer, offering his gift to congregations that shouted and swayed under his voice. But Carl's life would not stay confined to the traditional gospel circuit. His calling, as it turned out, was much bigger, bolder, and braver than music alone. In the 1970s, he broke out into the mainstream with the disco anthem, "I Was Born This Way," a song that became a declaration of pride for countless LGBTQ people at a time when the world was still quick to shame and silence them. For Carl, it was more than just a record. It was testimony. He sang openly about his identity, claiming his right to exist fully and without apology, something the church had never given him permission to do. While gospel often demanded secrecy from its gay and queer voices, Carl refused to hide. His music became ministry in its own right, pulsing from dance floors into hearts that had long ached for affirmation. But he didn't stop with music. Carl Bean's deepest work came in the church he later founded, the Unity Fellowship Church, which welcomed those whom traditional congregations had rejected. It was a spiritual home for LGBTQ believers, a place where faith and identity could exist without contradiction, where people could pray and praise without fear being cast aside. As bishop, Bean poured himself into this ministry, extending love to those who have been told for too long that God's love did not belong to them. Carl's story is radical precisely because it is tender. He lived openly gay. He preached openly gay. and he ministered openly gay. In a gospel world where so many had to whisper, he stood and shouted. His legacy is not only in the songs he sang or the church he built, but in the countless lives who finally saw themselves reflected in a faith leader. For every queer gospel singer who never spoke their truth, Carl Bean became a voice. For every church kid who prayed away feelings they couldn't name, Carl's ministry became a balm. He embodied a truth gospel music has always known deep down, that God's love is bigger than rules, bigger than fear, and wide enough to hold us all,